Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Unfortunately, Kevin couldn't make it. He's grounded in Manhattan with a pretty nasty ear infection, but I'm really excited to tell you a little bit about some of the aging-related work we've done in our lab recently, and hopefully I'll provide an acceptable substitute. So, for decades now, studies have garnered evidence for what has been called the rosy glow of old age. We know that older people preferentially attend to and remember positive information, and they report more positive emotional experiences in everyday life, as we just heard. In the brain, older people show relatively spared structure and function in subcortical brain regions involved in generating emotions, and in tandem, they also tend to show higher prefrontal activity when viewing positive and negative stimuli, a finding which has often been interpreted in terms of reflecting top-down emotion regulation processes. On the other hand, we also know that many higher cognitive functions, as well as the PFC systems that support them, tend to show a relatively steep decline in older age. So in our lab, we look a little more closely at emotion regulation in aging. As we've learned from Dr. Carstensen, it seems that our emotional goals really change a lot as we get older. As we get older, we tend to prioritize positive emotional experiences to a greater extent. In terms of the underlying brain mechanisms of emotion regulation, this could involve either or both of intact reactivity circuits that are tuned to generate different bottom-up emotional responses, or it could also involve regulation abilities that vary by strategy. So in other words, whether an older adult is successful at regulating emotion could depend on whether the strategy that's being used is aligned with chronic goals, and whether it depends on relatively spared versus relatively impaired neural systems. So in general, research in emotion is guided by a consensus model in which emotional responses are generated in stages. So first, an emotionally evocative situation is encountered, and then you attend to it. Afterwards, you appraise it as meaningful or goal relevant, and then an emotional response is generated across different response channels. Neurally, we know that this process of emotion generation depends critical on the subcortical regions like the amygdala and the ventral striatum. So strategies for emotion regulation are typically understood in terms of which stage of this process is intervened on. So you could intervene by just, as we've heard, selecting an entirely different situation, selecting to engage in positive and not negative situations. You could intervene by redeploying your attention away from the negative toward the positive. If you have to attend to the negative thing, you could still use a cognitive change strategy to deliberately reframe the meaning of that stimulus in order to feel different about it. And finally, you can also try to directly modulate the response, for example, by inhibiting your emotional behavior. In terms of the brain, we know that this kind of deliberate regulation, and especially reappraisal, which has received the most study, depends on a network of regions, including ventrolateral and dorsolateral PFC, as well as dorsomedial PFC, posterior parietal, and lateral temporal cortex. So in the first behavioral study I'll tell you about, we asked whether older and younger adults differed in their ability to use distraction as a strategy for emotion regulation versus reappraisal. So there were 3 trial types. There were look trials in which participants were just instructed to respond naturally to negative or neutral images. There were also reappraisal trials in which they were instructed to reappraise the meaning of the images in order to feel less negative. And then finally, there were also distraction trials in which people were just asked to keep 6 letters in mind over the delay. Then they viewed a negative or neutral photo. There was a probe period that was really only relevant for the distraction trials. And then everyone at the end of the trial rated the strength of their negative affect. So we quantified 3 things. First, the strength of people's bottom-up negative emotional reactivity. Second, their success in using reappraisal to downregulate negative affect. And third, their success in using distraction to downregulate negative affect. So, interestingly, we saw no age differences in bottom-up reactivity or distraction success. However, we found that older adults showed significantly lower ability, or lower success in using reappraisal, which suggests a specific impairment for this strategy rather than distraction. So, in subsequent research, our lab has begun to appreciate that not every kind of reappraisal is created equal. So perhaps there are some kinds of reappraisal for which older adults can show comparable success to younger adults. And this is particularly important to understand because not every situation in life can be avoided or modified or distracted away from. So specifically, when we're confronted with negative situations, we're able to use reappraisal to not only diminish our negative feelings, but also to fundamentally transform them in some cases to feel positive emotions like love, hope, gratitude, optimism. So, for example, in response to an image like this, you could apply what we call minimizing reappraisal to dampen negative affect by saying something like, this child is probably crying for no real reason, soon she'll get tired or distracted and stop. On the other hand, you could use what we call positive reappraisal to say something like, soon this child will be safe in the arms of her caring mother, feeling much better about whatever she was worried about. Right? So here you're focusing on positive outcomes, positive interpretations to enhance positive feelings. So in a study that included both behavioral and fMRI data, we asked whether older adults differed from younger adults in their success in implementing these different kinds of reappraisal. Minimizing and positive reappraisal were blocked to avoid having to switch back and forth between the two reappraisal strategies, but there were also negative and neutral pictures where people were just responding naturally, which provide like a within block baseline. So each trial had a 2-second instructional cue, a photo period where they're applying the instructive strategy. This is where we collected the brain responses. And then everyone rated on every trial both negative and positive affect to index both of these. So here we can look at reactivity as well as regulation success for both negative and positive affect. So in terms of negative affect, the first thing to note is that older and younger adults showed comparable levels of negative affect when just responding naturally to negative images, consistent with the prior study. Also consistent with the prior study, when we look at the difference, like the ability to use reappraisal to downregulate negative affect, we find that younger adults show a much lighter drop than do older adults, suggesting diminished negativity dampening capacity in the older adults. However, turning to positive affect, we see a different pattern. Here, there's actually a large difference at baseline, such that older adults are spontaneously reporting more positive affect when just responding naturally to negative images. And then if you look at in terms of this difference, like the ability to use reappraisal to upregulate positive affect, in a sense, there's an interaction here suggesting that there's like a diminished positivity enhancing capacity in the older adults. But I would definitely put a question mark at the end of that, because if you look at this pattern another way, the result is basically the same. When asked to use positive reappraisal, younger and older adults reach the same level of positive affect, and really this interaction is being driven by these baseline differences. Okay, so this was an fMRI study, so we can ask about brain systems involved in implementing emotion regulation. The first thing we did, just very simply, we collapsed across reappraisal strategies to ask what parts of the brain are more active when people are asked to reappraise than when they're just responding naturally to negative images. And then we did a conjunction of activity in younger and older adults to find areas that are consistently activated by both groups. And when we do that, we find this canonical reappraisal network being consistently activated by both younger and older adults, including VLPFC, DLPFC, posterior parietal, dorsomedial PFC, and lateral temporal cortex. However, we also saw age differences in PFC recruitment. Younger adults showed more robust activation in the lateral and medial PFC. So in order to probe this pattern more directly, we extracted activity estimates from bilateral VLPFC across experimental conditions, and we saw this overall pattern, which was very interesting, because it suggests that age differences in VLPFC recruitment were driven by spontaneous PFC recruitment by older adults in this look naturally at negative images condition. So just to unpack that a bit, when we're looking at the minimizing reappraisal block, younger and older adults are showing a very similar pattern of activity. They're only engaging VLPFC when they're instructed to reappraise, whereas in the positive reappraisal block, older adults are showing a qualitatively distinct pattern. They're engaging PFC both for the natural response trials and the positive reappraisal trials. So obviously we found this very interesting. We did a follow-up whole brain search to see if there were any other regions where older adults were showing this pattern. And when we did that, we found that it was only shown in left and right VLPFC. And again, this was not shown by the younger adults. So what about the brain systems that generate emotional responses? First, we looked at the amygdala. We saw very comparable levels of amygdala reactivity across younger and older adults, more amygdala to negative versus neutral images, and very similar across age groups. And lastly, we turn to the ventral striatum, which is a core region of the brain's reward system involved in generating positive emotional responses. Here, we found age differences such that, one, older adults showed greater striatal activity in general, and also the degree of their ventral striatum activity tracked in a trial-by-trial manner with how positive they felt for both the uninstructed look trials as well as the instructed positivized trials, whereas the younger adults really only showed that when they're instructed. So finally, we did a functional connectivity analysis to ask how this spontaneous positive affect related to connectivity between ventral striatum and PSC. And here we found that a correlation such that it was the older adults who showed the most spontaneous positive affect who tended to show more positive connectivity between ventral striatum and dorsomedial PSC as well as dorsolateral PSC. So we interpret this as suggesting that for the older adults who are feeling the most positive, there's some spontaneous top-down regulation of ventral striatum happening, even when not instructed. So just to sum up, in terms of reactivity, we found some evidence for intact reactivity circuits functionally that are tuned to generate different responses, intact emotional reactivity and amygdala responses, greater spontaneous positive affect, greater ventral striatal responses, but we also found evidence that regulation ability varies by strategy. There was clearly diminished negativity dampening capacity behaviorally, but there was spared positive reappraisal ability, relatively spared, and we also found evidence for a kind of positivity-enhancing mindset that goes beyond instructed trials. Just briefly, some unanswered questions. As Dr. Carstensen kind of prefigured, the design of these studies is really best for asking questions about whether people have an ability to regulate when you specifically instruct them to. They're not as well designed to ask questions about tendencies to enact regulation. So we've done a very exciting follow-up study to this where people are choosing to spontaneously regulate or not, and we find that older adults regulate more frequently, and we're asking what underlying brain systems mediate this age-related difference in motivation. We're also very interested in our lab in whether training can enhance performance. For older adults, can we enhance their negativity dampening capacity? For younger adults, can we actually enhance their spontaneous positive affect response to make them look more like the older adults? And also, importantly, we don't always just reappraise for ourselves, we often reappraise for other people. We're very interested in this kind of social regulation, which we think might reflect an area of spared or enhanced ability across the lifespan. So thank you very much to my collaborators who did this work with me, and thank you very much for your attention.